first thing we're going to talk about is how to draw a sphere. So if you watched our last lesson, either the workshop lesson or the beginning workshop lesson, you have learned about lines, and you will learn about how 2D lines transfer to 3D and vice versa, and how to find those shapes in everyday organic objects like people, hands, elephants, etc. Right now we're going to see some live action streaming of what happens when a light source changes on a sphere, a cube, a cone, and a cylinder. Right now it's backlit just to start out with, and you can see a lot of the ambient light come in from over here. Ambient light just means light that's in the environment. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise it up. It's going to start to come over here. And right now, if you take a look at the sphere, the brightest point of the sphere is going to be pointing directly back up to the light source. It's going from here straight up. And as I start to change the light source, where it's going with this single bulb, it's going to change how light wraps around each one of these objects, just like we discussed. It's also really important to note at this point that we are taking a look at a white background with white objects. That makes a huge difference in our shadow and our light. Right now our light source is directly overhead. Now I'm going to be moving it further away, coming this way, and you can start to see it changes the angle of those shadows. Look how the shadows are getting longer, just like the sun does as we run out of space for our light to be above our objects. The sun bulb is rising again, going straight overhead. And we can see these objects start to change. As night falls down, you have the backlight of the moon, and that's why things look a lot of the ways that they do. Now when we're drawing things, this kind of helps us to think about light sources. Light sources are really important in shading. It's not just about drawing what's in front of you, but it's also about drawing what you see around you. So right now we have white walls in our tiny little shadow box room, and those white walls are reflecting back on every piece of these different shapes. Watch what happens when we start to change our background. Watch what happens to the reflective light that bounces off the walls and the floor onto the different objects, and see how they change. Before we do that, I want you to take one more look at our sphere. I'm going to bring it a little bit to the left and up above, right about here. And when you're looking at it now, I want you to kind of memorize visually what this spot looks like. When we're going to change to the black, I want you to notice how the light changes. I want you to see how it bounces off different objects differently, and watch how much darker it gets in your shadows and your reflective light. The light that bounces off the bottom of the floor onto your sphere is going to look very different. It's not going to be as bright. And if we watch it, the shadows are a little difficult to trace because it's not a light background. But also look underneath the sphere at this point. I'm going to set it right about where we had it for the other one. And notice that the reflection coming underneath the sphere is very different with a dark background. Look at the other shapes as I move the light around. A very similar thing is starting to happen. And notice how there's not as much ambient light as I move the light much further distance away. And even start to turn it in opposite direction so that it's not directly bright. Look at the shadows and look at the brightest point that you have. Now releasing the light again to come back. And it's going to go over. It's going to set. And just leaving that backlit area there, the same as we would see at night. It's a very extreme view from the side, with part of the light being blocked in this area here. And let's return the light source directly overhead like we did for the white background. And see how bright it appears on the top and how dark on the bottom. When directly overhead, you can see that the objects, especially the sphere, take on almost a half and half, kind of look like a bobber, or maybe like a Pokemon ball for those of you who've got to catch them all. We're going to discuss how a sphere is shaded. We just looked at a video of how different types of lighting affects light and shadow on a sphere, on a cube, on a cone, and on a cylinder. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to actually apply those when we're actually going to go ahead and shade. Now, shading comes in a variety of different types, and we're going to discuss that. But right now, we're referring to shading as the light and the dark that we apply with our pencil graphite. So how hard we press on something with this pencil determines, when we're drawing, how dark something gets or how light it is, and if we erase anything, like the white part up here, etc. So over here, if we see the sphere, the light is coming from an angle that's kind of like this. Remember what we talked about before is you want to trace back wherever your light source is. So this looks like one major light source in the room, okay? And it's kind of coming at an angle like this. We know this because if we go down and we look here, we can see the shadow and it reflects the same kind of way going back up here, okay? So the cone of light that comes down on this is going to be sort of you can trace it back to the edge here, like this. If it were going to go straight up, it would make a cone of light up here somewhere that comes down. And see how that shadow stays within that boundary? Now, shadows are pretty complicated. We're going to work some more on those at a later time. But today, we're going to primarily be focusing on the shading on the actual object, not necessarily what's going on around it so much. So as you see here, there's the highlight, which is the very brightest part where the most light is showing on whatever object you're drawing, in this case, the sphere. Next, there's the transitional light, or they call it the middle value, okay? And value just means from light to dark, dark to light. It's a gradient, and a gradient is the same thing. It's another word from light to dark, dark to light. So we see here it goes from light, and it's almost white there, to slightly darker, and then to kind of a medium darkness. And as it gets fuzzy down here, this is called the core of the shadow, and every object has a core of the shadow in it, which means inside the object is just the darkest part, okay? And then down here, you can see it says reflected light. See how it gets a little bit lighter at the bottom, kind of going around the edge where the dark part is? You see that difference? And around the edge here, it looks like the sphere is darker itself, but actually it's the background, okay? So we want to make sure we pay attention to that. That's important. We're not really talking about the stuff going on in the background right now. However, we do have to pay attention to right here, the reflected light. Whatever is bouncing off the table, whatever it's on, just like we did with our black and our white box areas where we did our shapes in them, we want to pay attention to the reflected light that's happening here too, because that's going to tell us how bright or dark the reflected light is here. And then there's the cast shadow. The cast shadow is a direct reflection, per se, of the light that comes from here, okay? So whatever the shape is that's formed when the light falls, like we said before, we can trace back our light source this way. If I go straight up like this way, and if I was going to go woo all the way off the table, you can see it's starting to make a cone, and wherever the cone ends would be where our light is, okay? So this is an important part of shading. When we look over here and we apply it to all the different other shapes that we have, that we use in our everyday drawing, Okay, so looking at this cube, we're going to see here that we have the same as we normally do on our sphere. We have the cast shadow. We have a little bit of reflected light, just like we did underneath here, but the shape happens to be different. We have the highlight. We have where our light source is coming from, and then we have transition and tone from light to dark, okay? And then ambient light, which we talked about a little bit when we talked about our backgrounds with our shadow boxes before, okay? When we did our shapes just a couple minutes ago and our white background and our black background. Remember how we talked about that ambient light? And sometimes you can get light coming in on a shadow as well too. And when we talk more about shadows in the next lesson, we're going to talk about how shadows fuzz out and they have kind of a feathering effect that happens depending on how bright their background is. We're not too worried about the ambient light at the moment, but ambient light is a little bit part of reflected light, okay? And that could come in later on. So here, when we look and we see transition to tone, it's like this area right here in our sphere where it gets from lighter to darker, to kind of a little bit darker again, okay? And then we have our highlight area here on this side, and same thing's happening. Look at, it's transitioning from tone from light to dark, just like it did over here. And then we see this side over here, wherever the brightest part of your light is, right there, shooting back down here, through the ball. If we were going right through the ball, our darkest part would be right underneath here, okay? It's kind of hard to see in the copier and on the video right here, but that's where it would be. So looking over here, that's the darkest part of our shadow over here. And then it's also on the other side, the darkest part of our shadow coming in this way right there too. And then it starts to get a little bit of reflected light coming there, okay? And you'll see this a little bit easier when you start to observe things in still lifes like we're gonna do. And you wanna keep an eyeball on that because it's very helpful, okay? That understanding of the sphere, like I said before, is really important in understanding pretty much all of shading on anything because it's the basis what we use. We apply that to all the other shapes. And these are just our basic shapes that we find. Just like in lesson 1, remember we found our triangle, we found our rectangle or our square, and then we found our circle. And there's a ton of other shapes, but those are the ones that we really kind of hone in on. And if we look over here, we have a cylinder and we have a cone. And look at how they are exactly the same. They have the highlight, just like over here. They have the core shadow, the dark part. It's not marked, but you have the transitional area here. And you have your cast shadow. And you can even see a little bit of reflected light. See that showing up there? So same thing over here. You have your highlight. You have your mid-tone kind of middle value area here. You have your core shadow, the dark part. You have your reflected light. See the little bit of light showing up there? And then you have your cast shadow. And all of these here, you can trace back your light sources on. It's not too bad. The cone is a little bit different. It's a little tricky sometimes, but you can still find it. It's kind of an inverse thing with a cone. Now that you saw how the sphere is shaded and how the light direction shows you how to shade a sphere, you kind of realize that everything's concentric, which means with circles, made of circles, okay? So if that's the case, then you can apply a circle to wherever you're looking on any shape that you make. So let's talk about that for a second and let's shade together. First of all, let's pick one of these. Let's find our light source and let's see, this block right here, okay? And we are going to make our light source coming from, let's see, right about there. That's where our brightest point is gonna be, okay? And it's gonna be hitting right in the middle of those two. So if it's hitting right in the middle of those two, this is how it's gonna be. So it's gonna be darker at the bottom, right? Gets lighter at the top. Darker at the back here. because the light's getting brightest going from here up, right? So darkening back this way, and remembering that we have the things that we learned about on our sphere. We have our core shadow we still have to put in, right? We'll have our reflected light that we'll put in just a minute. And I've drawn these lines on here just to help us see a little bit better, but when we're actually going to shade something, we want to be careful about that, because whenever we're drawing, we want to put in a real light framework. Your line should be more like that, less like this. This is simply so you can see what I'm doing. Now we have the bright to the dark here, and then we have the opposite here. So since the light's hitting this way, it's going like this, it won't see over this side. It's kind of like we chopped into a circle, and when we do that, the light can't see this side, okay? So that means the opposite's gonna happen here. This is where it's a little tricky with a block shape or a cube shape. So this part here is gonna be darkest. We're gonna kind of flip it. So we're gonna flip what's going on here. This is gonna be dark here, going outward like this. As we go back this way, it's going to get a little bit lighter because it's reflecting off. Now I'm going to use my little blending stump here. Go in and kind of blend the areas a little bit better. Then we'll do all our shadows and everything, deepen stuff as we go through. So make this a little bit darker there, the edge a little bit crisper. Same thing. Darkening this way a little bit. I like to put in my reflected light with my eraser. I think it's just a little bit easier. You can kind of control how much light you want to see there. I'm going to clean up my edge like this. Clean up my edge here like so. Back there, sweep. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to find the edges. Very gently edge the side of my blocks here like this. A little bit there, like that. A little bit brighter over this way, like so. And now what we have to do is we have to determine where our light source is coming from, like we did before. Light's coming from here down, and then that means that light source is going to be determined this way. So we're going to pay attention that it's coming from here. We're going to go back like this to take the bottom part, because the shadow only is really kind of involved with the bottom part of a cube like this. And then we find where our light source is hitting right there, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a line this way like that, and then that gives us this little shaded triangle where the darkest part of our shadow is going to be coming out like this. And shadows are always fuzzier, always fuzzier on the edges. Okay, that's important. That's because there's a feathering of light. Light kind of crawls around things in a respect, because it bounces off of other stuff. So if it's bouncing off of other things, the light's going to go hit from different angles here, but it's not going to be able to stay back there so well. And then there's always a little bit of darkness underneath your object, depending on if it's turned a little tiny bit. So you want to crispen that up just a little bit like that. Maybe darken the darkest part of this a little bit more here on the edge. Like that. Darken this little area here. And there you have yourself a nicely shaded cube using the directional method of finding light and then shading it in. And once again, it's the same as before. You have your core shadow, you have your midtones, your middle kind of shading, you have your highlight right there, and it happens each side like that. Now you can kind of attack it in kind of a circular method like this, or you can kind of do it as a straight back from light to dark. Don't forget your reflected light that's in there. That's important too. It's small, but it makes a big difference by the time you're done. This next section, we're going to go ahead and shade this cylinder by looking and finding where our light source is coming from. So I've identified a light source where here's going to be our brightest part of our cylinder. It's going to run through here. We're going to treat it, remember, like a sphere. Like we said, we kind of figure out where our brightest part is, and then we apply those different sections, like our core shadow, our midtones, our highlight, our reflected shadow, and our cast shadow. So it's coming up here. I'm going to make a little point of light like I usually do with a cone, and it's going to go past this area here and this area there. So if this is my brightest part here, that means my light, this thing right here, is tilted more towards us, like up here, kind of like this, rather than back there. So we want to think of that. And then I want to go ahead and I'm just going to do this in stripes then, because it's a cylinder and it'll appear rounded when we apply our dark to our light. So I'm going to start out doing this like so, using stripes. Striping method is just going back and forth, literally making stripes with your pencil. Going forth like this. It's our lighter area. Now I'm going to go ahead and start to darken. And I think cylinders are generally kind of fast. When you train your brain to see these different shapes, oh my gosh, can you draw very quickly. I'm being a little sloppy here because I'm busy talking. But as you're starting to just kind of experiment, also too, don't worry too much about perfection, guys. Like we talked about before, perfection is the worst. It doesn't help when you're learning at all. Just save trying to be perfect for another time. It's just not appropriate for art. It doesn't do you any favors. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my little squeegee guy here, my little blending stick, who's getting a little beat up now from this lesson. I'm going to go ahead, gentle that out a little bit, get down there to darken. I'm going to come out here and I'm going to clean up the edges of my cylinder a little bit. Go back in and firm them up with some drawing in a second. There we go. We have our reflected light there, but ooh, what about our little shadow here? Well, that's where it can get kind of tricky. Whenever you're doing this, you want to kind of pretend that this line is here as if there was a box through here. And every circle can be put inside of a box, okay? And vice versa. So I'm going to go up. I'm going to pretend that there is a square here, and I'm going to use this line here to go through there, like that. Same thing here, like that. And then I'm going to bring down the shadow to come down this way. It's going to get bigger as this gets bigger. That's important because this is foreshortening. And I'm going to come underneath here, which is the darkest part. I'm going to make that dark. And this part here is going to come out too. This is what's kind of interesting. It's not going to go past this area here. Okay. A little bit darker there. Again, a little bit darker here. Shadows get fuzzy as they get close to the edge. Accidentally put in my reflected light already, so that's nice. Darken this area a little bit. And then we have this little fella here. Remember how we said wherever the brightest part is here, where you can see the light, on the opposite side where you can't see it, where it's flat, it gets darker. So you guessed it, that means this puppy up here is going to be very dark, right? Very dark up here. And then less dark as we get to the edge there. Okay, so we'll start small. The our highlight here, but our highlight has to grow a little bit as it gets closer to the edge there. And my hands are wobbly today. Okay, and then don't forget that around every object there is a background. And when you're doing light and darks of things, it's not these lines that we have here that show us how bright or dark something is. That's just our little framework. It's kind of how our house is built when we're building a house that we're drawing per se with metaphor, we are not using that as the end-all be-all of our construction. We're using that as a framework to figure out where the lightest and darkest parts of things need to go, and then lines show up by themselves. So if we do this correctly, by the time we're done, we won't really need to see many lines because lines show up automatically when you shade something. So we can see there, and I'm actually going to fade this shadow a little bit over there. This is kind of the pocking method where I'm going bloop, 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 like that. I'm picking up graphite on the end of my eraser. A lot of people like these sticky erasers, the gum erasers. I am not a fan. I do not like them. Okay, and there you go. We have our light coming down here, our light source right there. We have the angle coming here where we see the end of our shadow. And then we even have a little bit of reflected light there, not a lot. Maybe put a teensy bit more in, and a little teensy bit at the end. There you go. And a teensy bit over there. There. And now we have a cylinder that's been shaded from a different angle. All right, so now we're going to find how to shade a cone. And what we're going to do here is we're going to put our light source right there. Okay, that's our dot for our light source where it's brightest. This is our light source and it's shining here. So that means that the bright part is going to be kind of like this right there. Okay, so we're going to start with shading in the opposite side where it's darkest, like we usually do. Going through and darkening this whole area there. As we're going through, we're being aware that our surroundings always have a little bit of some reflected shadow or light on them, but in this kind of mental space that we're making here, we're making sure that there's just kind of a general kind of background for us to have our object on. So we still see the little lines that are there like that, our shadow lines. And we're going to go ahead and start darkening this area in. This is our core shadow area as we discussed before. And using the striping method, working our way over, getting lighter. And you can also do light to dark, whatever works for you. There's not a wrong way to shade. It's the way that works best for you. That's all that matters at the end of the day when it comes to art and drawing especially. It's the way that works best for you. So going here, lighter, darker, darker to lighter, whichever you prefer. Merging in with my background slightly like that. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have a tiny bit of reflected light on the back like that. More reflected light here towards the front. A nice bright stripe down the middle here, getting a little bit thinner towards the top. We have to go ahead and make a little bit of an edge shadow here because it's furthest away from the light over there. Our line's going to be a little crisp down there. Doesn't need to be much. And then back here we have the tricky part, which is our shadow. The shadow line comes from these different lines here. So you have a line that goes right to the top of your point there. It goes to the point that's over here. I shifted it a little bit when I was drawing, but it's right there. It goes back. And then you have one that goes right in between here where your brightest light's going to be right there. So that's where your bright part of your reflection is going through there. And see kind of an imaginary line going like this. And what we do is we take about the length of this cone here and shift it sideways, put a little dot there and connect this part, and this will give you kind of your shadow there. I know, kind of complicated, but this is kind of the way computers do it. And we can train our brain to see things like that. Oh man, we can draw anything we want. But if you're nervous, you're scared, you're thinking, oh Jen, this is too much for me to handle all at once, it's okay. Just work on this part. Don't worry about the shadow yet, okay? I put the shadow in just so you can see how it comes together, but you don't have to do the shadow yet if you're a nervous Nelly. It's okay. All right, so I'm gonna go back here, remembering that the part that's closest is darkest, and as we go outward, it's gonna get less dark. Kind of hit some of my reflected light by accident there. I have to go back in. And you can see now that it's getting a little wonky because, where's the camera? Where is it? There it is. See, the tip of my graphite's getting kind of wonky. So you're going to want to keep an eye on that because it can really scratch the surface of your paper. And you don't want to scratch the surface of your paper if you can help it too much. Kind of running out of graphite there. Going through, gently kind of darkening as I go up there like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and, you guessed it, kind of smooth that out a little bit too. Okay, darkening here in that area again, going kind of towards the middle like this, outward. And our shadow always gets fuzzy at the edges, almost always. Unless your light source is really close to your shadow, really close, and very bright and contrasty, you're going to see very fuzzy edges like this. All right, so remembering that our light source hits the brightest right here, lines up with this line going back, and then we have here, I'm going to make this a little bit darker to match our shadow and our background a little bit more, like that. There we go, that feels better. Darkening this area up just a wee bit more. Starting to get piles of graphite a little bit because this isn't the world's best drawing paper. And then you can see here how the shadow works, coming down that way. We have our highlight, our core shadow, our midtones. We have our reflected light, and back here we have our cast shadow. Well, just a little snippet of cast shadow there. As you can see here, we have a shaded cone. And if you look, there's the light source here. This is our brightest spot there where the light hits, coming at this angle down here. And if we drive a line through this, like so, comes back to our light source. Remember we talked about how light comes out, I call it a cone of light, like this. This is the part where you're coming from. This part here and this part there. What you're going to do is for your length is you're going to take how long this guy is right here, this side, and you're going to turn it sideways like that. You just use your finger, go like that, put a point, and then make a line back here like this. And see how it makes this triangle here? That's your shaded area. And then we have our our darkest part here, which is our core shadow. We have our highlight. We have our reflected light. I'm just going to call it ref light. And then we have our cast shadow here. Notice how it's darker here and here. That's the area where light can't get to it the most.